Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is lesson 21. And now we're going to talk about how to transpose a pattern. This is where things will get more complicated for all of us, including me. But not really. It's really simple. First of all, as I started looking at patterns and looking at books and buying books, in fact I bought recently 4 books that said they were big knits. Not all of them are, by the way. I realized there was a kind of a cutoff in the category. So anything consistently, most of the big knit patterns are the size US 15 needles and up. That isn't always the case. So that's my hesitation. This calls itself big knits, but many of these patterns are for needles 13 and even a 10. So I wouldn't call that a big knit. I decided my cutoff was 15 millimeters, and that seemed more common, like in this Big Knit Love. And so I've added 2 new sizes to my knitting kit, and I suggest you could do the same. Look around the house, maybe you have something that will work. But there are 2 sizes to look at when thinking about needle size. There is the US size and the millimeter size, which is what they use in Europe. Now, the US size isn't related to anything, whereas the millimeter size is the actual diameter across. And so I added 2 new sizes, and I made them with, you can either use a 3/8 inch, and I use an oak dowel rod, so it would stay straight, and it wouldn't nick up easy. And I sanded it very smoothly, kind of rounded off the edge. You can make them as long as you want. Oak dowel rod comes in a 36-inch length, so you could cut it in half, or you could use the whole thing. These aren't pretty, but at the end I used the socket and spigot adapter that we used before, so it's the 1/2 inch socket and spigot. You can wrap, what I would suggest, either multiple layers of masking tape around the end of your pipe, and that's whether you use the dowel rod. You can even use the that one size of polyethylene tubing. It's the outside diameter that matters, even though it'll be sold by the inside diameter. This I just used some little skinny dowel rods inside, but they break easy. You could use metal pipe. I did the same thing with the socket and spigot. Now, the thing is, you want to center them inside that spigot. They're still considerably smaller. So I wrapped several layers of masking tape around. You could use some wood shims or a gasket. Then put your rod down inside, put some hot melt glue in there first. Then insert your rod with the masking tape or whatever you've used for a spacer, and that'll help keep it centered inside of there. Otherwise, you might end up with a rod that's kind of cattywamped. So, the 3/8 inch size, as I said, is a US 15 needle or a 10 millimeter diameter. And the other one I added was this. And I bought this over where they sell the water pipe, so on the next aisle over from all the PVC pipe. And this is called 1/2 inch ultra pure CPVC pipe. It's very smooth and nice, and comes in a 10-foot, 5-foot, or a 2-foot piece. And the 2-foot length is exactly the same price as the 5-foot. So I made myself a couple pairs. You can see I used the regular standard elbow for these because it won't fit inside the socket and spigot. And these are only 40 cents. The socket and spigots are $1. And glue it in just like you did before. Take your writing off if you want. I didn't, so I could show you what it says on here. Then I made them in a couple sizes. I made this size, and I made a 12-inch size. This is one piece of the 5-foot cut in half. So when you go into the plumbing department, just ask them, will you please just cut this in half for me? And that'll give you a 30-inch pipe, which will hold a whole lot of stitches and will help you make patterns when it calls for knitting in the round. Then you don't even have to change the stitch you use. You'll just have to put a seam in. So you may decide, well, you'll have to look at the pattern to see where to put the seam. So anyway, I've added these 2 sizes, by the way, to my kit, and that fills this whole gap. And I'm going to publish in my video for this all these different comparisons. I think it's a good idea if you want to know what size pipe you have. The easiest thing really to do is to take a thin piece of paper and wind it around your pipe and mark it with a pencil where they cross, and lay it out. If you don't have calipers, that is, you know, and lay it out and measure by the millimeters because it's much more accurate. And then you'll get the European size. So there's that. Now, you will recall from all our other lessons that when you are knitting on knitting needles, and this is for the benefit of people who have never used knitting needles, if I want to knit something like a stockinette fabric, like you see here, on straight knitting needles, I need to know 2 stitches. I need to know how to knit it, and I need to know how to purl it. And when you look at stockinette fabric, you'll have the side with the V's, and the back side is called the purl side, and it's the wrong side. It's the side where the fabric will curve into, and on stockinette, if this were tighter, this would even curl up. So, and if I wanted to do garter stitch, all I would have to do is 1 stitch, either all purl stitches or either all front, knit stitches. So that doesn't happen on the rods. The reason it happens here, and you can see this, I know that my last row that I knitted was actually a knit side, because this is the side now that's facing me. Your stitches that you're working are always kept in your left hand. So if I finish a row and I put the needle with the stitches into my left hand, I see that I have to work the wrong side, meaning I have to do my purl side now. When you do that on the stationary rods, that doesn't happen because you're knitting back and forth. And in my case, the way I've always told you to do it is to do your front stitch for your stockinette, which will mean that you have the wrong side. Now, you could actually knit a whole pattern by taking out your rods and switching them. So as soon as I got done with a row, I could put it over here. But that would complicate things in several ways. One, you'd have to change your stitch. You'd have to rotate that stitch when you piped it. The other thing is you're going to have to take it off after every row, and if you're working with extra long pipes or very heavy, with your cover pipes in with your pins, that gets kind of awkward and it really cuts down it makes it much slower. Cuts your speed down. The other thing for me is I just can't keep track of my rows as easily. I've tried it before to do it this way, and I think the simplest way is to leave the pipes as they are and to change your stitch and to treat your stationary rod stand like the way the stitches would come out if you were knitting in the round. Now you'll see when you go to to look at knitting patterns and you go to transpose them, look carefully, make sure if you're just starting out and you don't know anything about knitting particularly, I would suggest getting some very simple knitting books. They'll say something like, I can't believe I'm freaking knitting, I taught myself knitting, knitting made simple, whatever they are. Sometimes they're in a kit with knitting needles and a little stitch counter and all that jazz. The knitting needles are kind of worthless because they're too skinny and they're metal. But the point being is, they will show you in these books all the different increases, all the different decreases, different ways of casting on. You might even try knitting a few rows. It'll show how to slip a stitch. These are things I haven't even started to talk to you about. So it'll familiarize you with not just the motions of knitting. There's really only 2 stitches. There's your knit stitch and your purl stitch. You're either going in the front of the stitch or the back of the stitch. But the thing that complicates knitting is the shaping. So when you start to make a garment, for example, like a sweater, you might start out, it's all simple enough, but then you get to the armholes and the neck, and so then that's where you start to increase and decrease stitching, and that's what complicates things. So, because of course you can't cut knit fabric. So that's what all those increases and decreases are about, and it's good to familiarize yourself with that and to have a picture to refer to. Now, when you're doing that, you may actually want to turn your knitting stand around. Because remember, when I invented this whole thing, I was kind of using that as my reference point. So when you're looking at your rod stand from the back, you're seeing it as somebody would on knitting needles, and that'll help it make more sense to you. What makes it different, again, on the rod stand, is because because the stitches aren't always here, you're actually working right to left, back to the right, and not turning the stitches around. That's why you have to use a second stitch, for instance, when you're making stockinette. If I wanted to do that on straight knitting needles, I need 2 stitches. The front stitch, which is really your knit stitch, and I need the back stitch, which is really a purl. So when you do that on the stationary rod, you only need the 1. So it's somewhat easier to transpose a circular knitting pattern when it says in the round. Not everybody uses circular needles for that. Sometimes you'll see a pattern that calls for circular needles only because they're very long, and it'll tell you the length. It might say use a 19, a US, something like a US 19, which is a 15 millimeter, that are 36 inches long. Well, they're referring to that cable, and because it'll hold all those stitches. So when you see a pattern like that, you don't have to change the stitch each time. If it's, well, you will if it's being used as a straight needle. If it's in the round, you could keep the stitch the same. I know this sounds confusing, but it'll make more sense as we go along. But say, for instance, this is the next pattern I'm going to show you. And this is a cable pattern from a free Lion Brand pattern. And I changed the yarn, and I changed the size of the rod, and I changed the size. And the next time I do a video, it's going to be how to do a cable stitch. But this was for straight knitting needles. So in order to make this, I did what it told me on every odd number row. The first one, which is basically the right side, or no, the right side is your left side if you were knitting on straight needles. So on every odd number row, I did exactly what it told me. So for instance, it told me on row 1, 3, 7, and 9, I should knit the first 2, then purl 2, then K to the last 4 stitches. Well, that simply means, in our case, front stitch to the last 4 stitches. Then it told me to purl 2, back stitch. Then it told me to knit 2, front stitch. On row 2, it had me K4. Well, that means knit 4. But that's an even-sided row, and I know I need to reverse it. So now I know I need to purl 4 or back stitch 4. So if you get the idea that by doing it this way, I know that when I come back to my work, as I left it here last night, I know that my next row is going to need to be an even numbered row. I can verify that by looking at my stitch counter and see I have 1 clicked, which means I just completed my first row in the series. And I know I can start my second row. So for me, that makes a lot more sense than trying to switch my pipes back and forth and turn my stitches. So my suggestion would be to get a very basic knitting book, which will help you visually, especially if you're like me and you kind of have to figure it out visually. It will help you read a pattern because it'll give you all the definitions, and every pattern book is different. Some are European. This book is a beautiful book. It's German. She uses a whole lot of double-pointed needles, though. So I don't really recommend this book, but she has some really neat things like herringbone, and I'm going to figure out how to do that on the rods. I haven't done it yet. So you want to be careful of what you buy. This would be really cute, by the way, for teenagers. This one. It's a bunch of little cowls and things like that, but they're kind of young. And those are easy patterns. But again, my suggestion would be to, you've got to read through the pattern. Look, Lion Brand has zillions of free patterns, for example. That's what this is from. And those are the only ones you'll see if I transpose them. I don't want to transpose something that is a copyrighted material because that would just be wrong. But something that's free, look for something easy. Look for something that already has, look to see what the needle size is. You want to get one for a US 15 and up, and check the kind of yarn, and you'll want to learn how to knit a stitch. They'll tell you to knit a gauge swatch, and that's something else that's in these books. So that will help you as we go along in these next several videos in terms of transposing your pattern. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching.